need a hat, actually. Is what you need. All right, I am sorry, guys, for the delay. This was. Oh, so it's actually funny how Jewish studies, our meetings are ridiculously slow to get started, like 15 minutes late every time. But like the meetings, yeah, like they are started pretty promptly. Yeah. Yeah, right, of course. Yeah, right. There's nothing. Right, exactly. There's nothing.
Rachel, not Rachel, sorry.
Kirsten.
Kirsten, would you just speak to the mic for a minute?
Sure. Yeah. Does this sound right?
Testing.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. I don't know any other testing things to say. Okay. Rachel, yes, thumbs up. You heard me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. All right. So should I? All right, I'm just going to wait. All right. Should I get started?
Yeah.
Yeah, wait. He's in charge, exactly. Everybody else wants me to start, but he's the guy in charge. All good? All right, wonderful. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much. We apologize for the delay, but it is all in the hopes of being able to communicate this with as many people as possible. We're thrilled to have this audience here on a Sunday morning. My name is Kirsten Fermaglish. I'm a professor of history and Jewish studies here at MSU, and I really want to welcome everyone here. I'm thrilled to see everyone here and welcome people who are going to watch this on live stream as well. To the Leonard Gillman Symposium on Jewish Perspectives on Reproductive Rights, Jews, Religious Liberty, and Reproductive Freedom in the United States. And this is part 1. There is a sequel. October 16th, I'll be repeating this again. We'll be having an additional historical perspective and some politicians to come speak about the subject, which we think is incredibly timely and important. I want to thank everyone who's made this possible, particularly, certainly, Yael Aronoff, Laura Yaris, people, Ariana Menzel, people in the Jewish Studies program who have helped us to put this day together, as well as Bob Bishop, who is helping us with the live stream. I'd also like to thank our generous co-sponsors, the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Social Science, James Madison College, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, the Department of History, the Center for Gender and Global Context, Peace and Justice Studies, and International Studies and Programs. So thank you all to everyone for making this possible. We have 3 wonderful speakers. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd actually like to give I'd like to give you some information about this symposium. It's been generously sponsored by the Leonard Irving Gillman Endowment for Jewish Culture here at MSU. We're so pleased that Leonard's wife, Terry Champney, and her son, Aaron Gillman, are joining us today via our live stream, so welcome. Leonard Irving Gillman had a passion for exploring Jewish culture. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and he was interested in both the Jewish cultures of Eastern Europe, as well as American Jewish culture, American Jewish history, and Judaism. The Leonard Irving Gillman Endowment for Lectures and Engagement in Jewish Culture in the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel supports programming related to Jewish culture and particularly American Jewish culture and history. We're so grateful for the support of the Gillman and Champney families to make this event possible today. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. I just want to make sure I get everyone right. We are thrilled to have 3 wonderful speakers here today, people who I know very well, who I've spoken to. I asked about this a few months ago, and I'm thrilled that it actually has been able to happen. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking today. And then what this will be, just so everyone knows, it's going to be a round table. So I will introduce everyone all at once. Each of them will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes on their research, which all deals with the subject of Jews and reproductive freedom historically. And then we will have a roundtable. I'll have some questions that I and Laura Yaris, my co-organizer for this event, have developed, but we also will welcome questions from the audience, and we'll ask you to speak over at the microphone that's over there so that Rachel can hear you and so that our live stream audience can hear as well. So without further ado, let me introduce these fantastic historians. Dr. Rachel Kranson is the Director of Jewish Studies and an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She is the author of Ambivalent Embrace, Jewish Upward Mobility in Postwar America, which received the honorable mention for the Best First Book Award of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society 2017. She's also a co-editor of A Jewish Feminine Mystique, Jewish Women in Postwar America, which was also a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies in 2010. Her current book project, Religious Misconceptions, American Jews and the Politics of Abortion, traces the history of American Jews' engagement in the struggle for reproductive rights and access. And Rachel is the person on your screen over there. The next person I'd like to introduce is Samira K. Mehta, an associate professor of women and gender studies and Jewish studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research and teaching focus on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States. Her first book, Beyond Chrismica, The Christian-Jewish Blended Family in the United States, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Mehta's current academic book project, God Bless the Pill, which is a fantastic name, Sexuality and Contraception in Tri-Faith America, examines the role of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant voices in competing moral logics of contraception, population control, and eugenics from the mid-20th century to the present, and is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. Her book of personal essays, The Racism of People Who Love You, is forthcoming from Beacon Press in 2023. Mehta is also the primary investigator for a Henry Luce Foundation-funded project called Jews of Color, Histories and Futures. She holds degrees from Swarthmore College, Harvard University, and Emory University. That's Samira there. Okay, and finally, Ronit Weistal, I will say the Y, even though that is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is also a faculty affiliate of the Religious Diversity Cluster of the Othering and Belonging Institute, the Center for Jewish Studies, and the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Currently a Greenwall Foundation faculty scholar in bioethics, she is working on a new book, Troubling Conscience, Religious Freedom and Healthcare in Modern America, which examines the long history of religious hospitals, government funding, and conscience rights in the United States. She is the author of the award-winning Enlisting Faith, How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America, which was Harvard University Press, 2017. And I want to welcome back Ronit and Rachel, who have both spoken here before, and welcome Samira for the first time. We're thrilled to have you. And I'm just going to get it started with Rachel, please.
Okay. Hi. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay?
A little too much. We're going to work on that.
Much.
Yeah. Is that I turned it down pretty much the lowest it can go on my computer, Bob. Try again.
Is this all right?
Yes, that's much better.
Screaming.
That's much better.
Okay.
Okay.
So, first of all, I should let you all know that I am coming to you from the very uncomfortable land of COVID. I am thrilled to be here, but I'm definitely feeling some brain fog. So thank you in advance for bearing with me if it takes me a little longer than usual to gather my thoughts. I also really want to thank everyone at Michigan State who organized this panel, who gave me the ability and the opportunity to participate even once I came down with COVID and couldn't be there in person like I really, really wanted to be. I have helped organize hybrid events at my institution, and they really are a lot to manage. So I just really appreciate all the labor that went into making this possible for me. And I am very grateful to all of you. So let me start by recalling an event that happened fairly recently on May 17th, 2022. The National Council of Jewish Women brought thousands of activists to Washington, D.C. for a Jewish rally for abortion justice. And at this event, which was co-sponsored by nearly every liberal Jewish organization in the country, Sheila Katz, who's the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women, declared that abortion rights were not only, this is a quote, a deeply Jewish issue, but also a religious freedom issue. And in recent years, the leaders of the National Council of Jewish Women have been doing the really important work of publicizing this notion that access to abortion is an issue of religious freedom that ought to be protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. And in making this argument, they draw on almost 50 years of American Jewish interventions into reproductive politics. And so my current research project, Religious Misconceptions, analyzes and traces this history of the liberal American Jews who tried to secure abortion rights in the United States through the First Amendment's guarantees of religious freedom. And drawing on the archival collections of liberal and feminist Jewish organizations, I tell the story of the Jewish lawyers and activists and rabbis and communal leaders who articulated distinctly religious reasons for supporting abortion access over the past half century. And in the process, they transformed the political strategies of liberal American Jews and upended not only how liberal Jews harnessed the First Amendment's guarantees of religious freedom, but also how they positioned themselves as political actors in the American state. And this is what I'd like to explain just a little bit about in my brief introductory remarks. So American Jews have a long history of engagement with the First Amendment of the Constitution, which promises religious freedom through two mechanisms. First, there's the Establishment Clause, which guarantees that American law can't prefer one religion over another. And secondly, there's the Free Exercise Clause, which invalidates any law that would make it impossible or difficult for an American citizen to freely practice their religion. And in the middle of the 20th century, and in particular from the 1940s through the 1960s, the lawyers that represented liberal Jewish organizations were some of the strongest advocates for a strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause. And what this meant was that these lawyers advocated for a very strict and an absolute separation between church and state, and argued that American Jews would fare best in a nation that was entirely secular and free of religious influence. Now, on some level, this was an odd position for Jewish leaders to take, because at least in the American context, Jews generally organize themselves as a religious group. So advocating for a strict separation of church and state seemed to undermine Jews' own ability to influence public policy as religious citizens of the United States. But Jewish lawyers adopted this strategy because they were very aware of their lack of power in relation to the Christian majority, and they understood that in American law, religion most often meant Christianity, and that religious influence in American law would often result not in shared power and religious pluralism, but rather in coercive forms of Christianity. And they witnessed this happening in certain respects. For instance, when Jewish children in public schools were forced to say the Lord's Prayer and to participate in Christmas pageants. So, not surprisingly, when the lawyers that represented liberal Jewish organizations first tried to protect abortion rights, they approached it as a church and state issue, and they saw it through the lens of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So in 1976, Congress was debating the first Hyde Amendment, which prevented public health care programs like Medicaid from funding abortion. And when the House Representatives debated passing this amendment, they consulted with Leo Pfeffer, who was a prominent lawyer from the American Jewish Congress. And to Congress that the Hyde Amendment was unconstitutional because it embedded Christian ideas about the origin of life into U.S. law.
See her, so you don't have to.
Is everything okay?
Oh, yeah, we're just turning to make sure speakers can see you. Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead, sorry.
So the Hyde Amendment passed in spite of Leo Pfeffer's objections, but the question of whether the amendment established religion into American law was hotly debated in the press, particularly once the Supreme Court decided to test the amendment's viability in the Harris versus McRae case of 1980. And conservative Christian activists pointed out that American laws often aligns with religious principles, such as laws preventing murder and theft, which, they pointed out were also part of the Ten Commandments. And so a lot of these activists feared that if the court decided that the Hyde Amendment was unconstitutional on the grounds that it established religion, that it would undermine the ability of any and all religious Americans to wield influence in the public sphere. And this concern gave some liberal Jewish leaders pause back in 1980. Even those who were strongly in favor of legal abortion wondered what impact the Harris-McRae decision might have on the ability of American Jews to advocate for their own interests as religious Americans. And some specifically wondered whether U.S. aid to Israel, for instance, could be declared unconstitutional based on this strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause. So one by one, liberal Jewish organizations started moving away from arguing for abortion access based on the Establishment Clause and the strict separation of church and state. And by 1989, when the Supreme Court tested another set of abortion restrictions in the Webster versus Reproductive Health Services case, the legal term of the American Jewish Congress developed a new argument for abortion access. And this was based not on the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, but rather on the Free Exercise Clause. And working in coalition with other liberal religious groups, they submitted an amicus brief arguing that abortion restrictions violated the First Amendment not by enshrining Christianity into American law, but rather by preventing citizens, maybe particularly Jewish citizens, from choosing an abortion should their religious convictions compel them to do so. So the Supreme Court justices in 1989 didn't address this free exercise challenge during the Webster case. And to this day, the court has never explicitly addressed the question of whether religious exemptions can be made to guarantee access to abortion. So legally, this First Amendment approach ended up being something of a dead end in terms of late 20th century reproductive access. But this approach to the First Amendment, which emphasized the religious interests of American Jews, represented a real change in terms of liberal Jewish political strategy. So for decades, liberal American Jews had argued that their interests as a religious minority often depended on the separation of church and state and the secular public sphere. But to gain leverage on the abortion issue, they insisted that American law ought to accommodate Jewish religious traditions that permitted abortion, and they began to insist on their rights as religious citizens. This strategy signaled a certain amount of confidence on the part of liberal Jews that judges and lawmakers would take their moral authority as seriously as they took the moral authority of conservative Christians on this issue. And they decided to place their trust in an ideal of religious pluralism that offered all religious groups equal access to influence and power. The fact that the strategy didn't succeed suggests that, at least with regards to reproductive issues, this confidence was misplaced. And liberal Jews and conservative Christians were not competing on an equal judicial playing field in the late 20th century. On the issue of reproductive rights, religious pluralism didn't necessarily translate to political power. and the fact that abortion access has only grown more restrictive in the 21st century shows that nothing much has changed in this regard, and that the privilege of conservative Christians, particularly on this issue, remains alive and well in American law and politics. So on that sobering note, let me just answer the question that I imagine at least some of you might be thinking, which is, why do I care about all of this legal history from almost 50 years ago? And why am I spending my time deep in the dusty archives of liberal Jewish organizations following decades of a failed political strategy? So the first reason is because this history is at the core of American Jewish politics. American Jewish historians have long noted that the Jewish preference for the Establishment Clause over the Free Exercise Clause started to break down by the mid-1980s. For them, I should say many of them interpreted this shift as a rejection of liberalism, led by Orthodox Jews who tried to harness government money for Jewish schools, and the right to place religious symbols on public property. But training our lens on the abortion controversy reveals that liberal Jews were also using this strategy, not as a rejection of liberalism, but as a way to make their religious liberalism more visible. To paraphrase my colleague Melissa Clapper, there's been a long-standing tendency among American Jewish historians, my eminent colleagues on this panel absolutely excluded, to overlook reproductive politics and to view the subject as more relevant to gender studies than Jewish studies. I should note, or I should say that this general proclivity to sideline issues of reproduction has led to a distorted view, I would say, of American Jewish politics and an incomplete understanding of how American Jews have related to the state and positioned themselves as political actors within it. Another reason that I'm so engaged in this history is because these late 20th century arguments for abortion access are every bit as relevant today as they were back in the 1980s, if not more so. The current Supreme Court, especially since the installation of Barrett, has been very supportive of the Free Exercise Clause and granting nearly all the exemptions based on the free exercise of religion, particularly if they were requested by conservative Christians. And the scholars of the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School have gone so far as to argue that the court's recent opinions have, and this is a quote, created a hierarchy of constitutional rights with religious rights at the top. So the question that legal scholars have now is, has the Supreme Court backed itself into a corner? Because eventually, now that Roe has been overturned and abortion is no longer guaranteed in the U.S. under the 14th Amendment, it seems rather likely that the question of Jews' religious rights to abortion will be tried in the courts. Perhaps Congregation Dorlador's suit in Boynton Beach, Florida will make it to the Supreme Court, or perhaps there'll be another case. For instance, in which a Jewish person who needs an abortion according to Jewish law may be denied that abortion in their state. But eventually, it's likely that the courts will have to explicitly address the question of whether Jews have a First Amendment right to abortion based on the Free Exercise Clause. And when the court denies Jews that right, which they probably will, even after granting conservative Christians nearly all of their First Amendment claims, it's going to force the American public to really grapple with what religious freedom means in America. When these cases move through the courts, I want the legal actors and activists and lawmakers who are fighting for abortion rights to be very aware that liberal American Jews have spent the last half-century fighting for a model of religious freedom that includes a pregnant person's right to turn to their own religious conscience when deciding whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. And I want them to be able to draw from those years of legal experience to make their own arguments stronger. So on some level, my current research is an offering to to the lawyers and the activists and the lawmakers who will soon be on the front lines of that fight. So that's what I have to say in terms of my introductory remarks, and now I'm going to turn things over to my colleagues. Thank you all so much.
Hello, can you all hear me? Oh, good. I want to start, of course, I'm going to move this so that it's a little bit more in line with my notes. I want to, of course, start by thanking Kirsten and Laura. Getting here was a little rockier and Laura than we would have hoped, and Laura was like constantly there on the other side of the text, figuring out how I was going to get here and how when I got here I was going to eat. And I'm profoundly grateful to her for all of that. And Kirsten for calling and help figuring out what we were going to do. I just think this is such an important and such a timely topic. I want to make kind of two notes before I really get into my presentation. And the first is Rachel made reference to our colleague Melissa Clapper, who wrote a truly excellent book called Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace. And I really want to commend that book to you for, I'm going to be doing a little bit of talking about things slightly before the start of my research. My research really picks up in 1943. So I'm about to tell you some things that come before that. All of that comes from Professor Clapper's work. She's an excellent historian and a truly phenomenal colleague. The other thing that I'm going to say is you're going to hear me talking about women in this and about men, really working on a gender binary. As a historian, I think it's really important that we think about these categories. I think that as people were making laws, as people were making policies, they were thinking on a gender binary, and we need to work with that and understand it. As an activist, and when I'm doing reproductive health work, I think it's really important to think about the terms that work best for the community that you're trying to reach. And often that can mean using language like pregnant people. And I think it's really important to remember that every law that hits cisgendered women hits non-binary people and trans men every bit as hard, except likely harder because of the other barriers they experience to access. But for now, I am going to be using language of women. So in 1915, Sidney Goldstein, who was the associate rabbi at the Free Synagogue in New York, what today is called the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, but at the time Stephen Wise was, the rabbi, wrote a piece that said birth control is a moral issue. And he wrote that the health, morals, and general welfare of the public, the moral good of voluntary motherhood, and the and he also made the argument that birth control would not lead to sexual immorality, which was a really big concern. It was a really big concern for Jews. It was a really big concern for Protestants. It was a really big concern for Catholic doctors like John Rock, who would develop the birth control pill and who would make the point that nice girls would not start having sex because they had contraception. They didn't have sex because they were nice, not because they were afraid of pregnancy. So there was this real sort of emphasis that unmarried contraception was going to help married people. It was not going to lead to people having sex outside of marriage. And so he's really making this argument in 1915. You'll notice that he doesn't really say a lot about Judaism in this. This is a public health argument. 10 years later, Stephen Wise of the Free Synagogue that we today call the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue, wrote that the teachings of the Jewish religion do not sanction birth control, but made the argument that one could use Jewish teaching to argue for contraception on the grounds that Israel holds human life to be sacred. Where this is basically going is the idea that if you've got a married couple and the wife's health will be damaged by pregnancy, then because of the sanctity of life in Jewish thought, birth control would be permissible. But he's sort of not arguing that birth control is allowed. In 1927, Rabbi Jacob Lauterbach, who is at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, makes the first really Talmudic defense of birth control. He's marshaling rabbinic teachings to argue that, in fact, birth control can be made acceptable by Jewish law, is acceptable in Jewish law. Here is how. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, like about kind of the nuts and bolts of this argument in a little bit when it kind of gets fully fleshed out for the kind of general readership in 1968 by someone else. And in 1936, Rabbi Moses D. Abels helps Margaret Sanger's assistant, a woman named Florence Rose, build a really solid Talmudic argument for the use of birth control as the Planned Parenthood Association is starting to reach out to clergy. So what I want you to see in that little snippet, and we're going to see this continue forward, is that what Jewish law is, what people are claiming Jewish law says about birth control changes and evolves over time, right? There is this tendency, and this is something that you can see in, again, Rachel made reference to the National Council of Jewish Women, to sort of say, like, this is what Jewish law says about birth control. Now, it is absolutely true, right, that Jewish law is based on classical texts, and the classical texts say what they say, reflective of the era in which they were written. But it's important to note that the ways in which people read those texts do change even subtly, right? There's a difference between saying, we're going to make this argument on moral grounds, we're going to do it knowing that we're rabbis, but we're going to sort of use universal morals rather than Judaism, to saying Jewish law doesn't say birth control is explicitly okay, but you can use Jewish law to get there, to saying, as will be said in 1968, Jewish law is like pro-contraception. And I'm going to work a bunch with that pro-contraception argument, but I want to note that there were other arguments that got made sort of on the way there. So in 1943, Planned Parenthood sets up its first National Clergymen's Council. And I did say clergymen, and I did say that on purpose, partly because that was the name of the organization, and partly because there were no clergy women involved, though there were, in 1943, there were some Protestant denominations that were ordaining a few women. It's a group that is made up primarily of Protestant and Jewish clergy. It's not their first attempt to work with clergy. In 1936, there's sort of an outreach attempt, but it's a little bit of a flash in the pan. They're kind of getting sympathetic clergy on board. They're doing this in part because of the Jewish statements that I've worked through, and they're doing this also because over the 1920s and 1930s, various Protestant denominations have come out with statements in favor of birth control. In fact, in 1931, there's a lot of attention to the fact that the Catholic Church, that sort of happens on New Year's Eve to New Year's Day, that the Catholic Church has said absolutely not. Why do they do that? I mean, partly because they think it, but mostly because the Episcopalians have just released a big statement in favor of birth control, right? So these things are happening in dialogue and in reaction to each other. Most Protestant arguments for birth control are rooted in sort of two things. The first thing that they're rooted in is real concern for the home and the health of the home. Protestants are worried about maternal mortality. They're worried about divorce. They're worried in part because both the sort of aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression are not, as you might guess, great for marital stability, right? So they're really trying to shore up the family. There's a moment of crisis about the family. And there's this real hope that if a couple can continue to have sex, and so have sort of a healthy sex life that will lead to fondness and romantic feelings and, you know, sort of less squabbling over who left their dishes in the sink, without having the added economic strain and emotional toll of additional pregnancies, the marriages will be stronger, happier, healthier. This will lead to stable homes. This will be really good for the family. And keep that in mind. That is going to, again, be a really important piece of the Protestant conversation moving forward. It's also going to be really appealing to liberal Catholics. The second concern that is a very big deal in Protestant circles and in other sort of well-educated circles are concerns about population explosion. This will culminate with the publication of the population bomb in the late 1960s, but you have this concern coming forward almost from the invention of antibiotics, or the discovery. I don't know how we should phrase that, really. I'm a religious historian, not a medical historian. But the concern here is basically that antibiotics and vaccines are social goods, but they're meaning that more children are living to adulthood. They're also meaning that people are living longer lives. Yes, it's an issue if instead of dying at 60, people are dying at 90 because you need to feed them and care for them for that additional 30 years. That's not really the concern. Really, the concern is if you have 6 kids and 3 of them live to adulthood, that is 3 reproductive members of society. If you have 6 kids and 6 of them live to adulthood, that's 6 reproductive members of society, right? And so while everyone is glad that there's less infant mortality, less child mortality, they're really worried that the population of the earth is going to outstrip its food supply. If this were a talk on Protestantism, I would spend a lot of time playing out the racial politics of what I just said. Because it's a conversation on Jews, I basically want to highlight, here are these concerns about sort of the global health of the planet and the family. These are the salient concerns for Protestant thinkers. For Jewish thinkers, what you see is, yes, concern about those things, but also, and this will feed very closely into what Dr. Kranson was talking about, concern about individual rights and liberties. So Rabbi Sidney Goldstein, remember him, the associate pastor, or associate rabbi, talks about the idea that it is a denial of civil liberties. He is on the Planned Parenthood National Clergymen's Committee, and in the notes, you can see a lot of concern from him that it's a denial of civil liberties to sort of cut off people's public health access. That if what medical science is telling us is that contraception can really do good things for maternal health, for the health of babies, right? So if you've got a healthier mother, you will have a healthier baby. And also, if you can space children well, you can nurse your children longer, right? There are lots of good public health reasons to do this. That it's a denial of civil liberties to cut off access to contraception. And so you really do see this, like, individual rights. It's not quite yet a religious rights language. It's a sort of everyone is entitled to their civil liberties. And this is largely, yes, it has religious implications, and it will get there. But for much of the 1940s and 50s, this is a class argument. We know that middle and upper class birth rates are dropping. Middle and upper class women and middle and upper class couples have access to contraception. It is, however, not usually available in public hospitals, in hospitals that are funded by the taxpayer. And so the Planned Parenthood National Clergymen's Council is really worried about equity. And again, it would not be wrong to wonder about the eugenic implications of this. They are aware of them, and especially in the Protestant thought, as this idea kind of develops, you see a lot of sort of saying, this is not, the state may not force people to use contraception. This must be a matter of individual moral conscience, but it's wrong to have access problems. And I think one of the debates that you'll see in the literature is there's all of this emphasis on creating clinics, creating access for the poor. And people will often argue that this is a eugenic issue. We want there to be fewer poor, right? We do not, in fact, and I'm using deliberately Christian language, right? We do not want the poor to be always with us, and that's what's going on for folks. historians like Melissa Clapper argue that that's not really a completely accurate picture of what's going on, because it can't, again, the upper classes are already using birth control, right? So it's not precisely, this is not in this conversation. There are parallel conversations happening, but this sort of Planned Parenthood Clergymen's Committee conversation is not quite a more white babies, fewer black babies, more wealthy babies, fewer poor babies model. It is a model that posits particular kinds of families as good and healthy, families that are scaled to their economic size. It privileges certain kinds of families over others. It has a lot of kind of white supremacy in that model of family, but it's not quite a have fewer babies, we are making you have fewer babies model. And so you see this conversation unfolding in Protestant and Jewish circles. Liberal Catholics are involved. There's a lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric going on in these internal conversations. And they're sort of proceeding. They start with the diaphragm. There's a really large push in New York City to make the diaphragm available in public hospitals. And it's basically a 2-month campaign of humiliating of Protestant clergy and Jewish clergy taking to their pulpits and taking to the press to basically say this is unacceptable. And the Protestants, again, are going with this healthy home attitude. And the Jewish clergy are using much more of a language of individual liberties, health rights, and religious liberty, right? This is where, in this debate, you start seeing that individual rights to medicine being coupled with sort of a Jewish understanding that a right to contraception is protected by Jewish law, and therefore sort of separation of church and state demands that remains available. And so I want to take a moment to develop sort of where that argument comes from in sort of conversations about contraceptive access. And the really kind of 2 key texts that I want to take a moment to think about are in the spring of 1967, in the journal Judaism, Alan Guttmacher, who is at the time the president of Planned Parenthood, writes a piece, Traditional Judaism and Birth Control. The following year, a conservative rabbi named David M. Feldman writes a book called Birth Control in Jewish Law, Marital Relations, Contraception, and Abortion as set forth in the classical texts. And honestly, if you go looking for a good halakhic description of Jewish attitudes towards birth control, this is still the thing that people recommend. And what both of these men argue is basically, and they're deliberately setting it in opposition to sort of an understanding of Christianity. And it's important to note that it's maybe not an understanding of Christianity that their Christian contemporaries would be super cool with. Just putting that out there. But they're basically saying, look, Christianity has a grudging relationship to the idea of sex. Now, I'm super aware that I'm talking in front of somebody who wrote a great book about evangelical attitudes towards marital sex, which are not grudging. Complicated, but not grudging. But these Jewish leaders, a really prominent obstetrician and gynecologist writing as a Jew, a rabbi writing on an expert in Jewish law and sexuality, are saying, look, Christian attitudes towards sex are grudging. Christianity says it is better to marry than to burn. So in other words, if you can't keep your lust under control, you should get married. But it would be better to keep your lust under control and remain celibate. Obviously, this isn't a Christian idea that really survives the Protestant Reformation, but they're arguing that it's still there. It's still in Protestant thought. But that Judaism, from its earliest texts in its rabbinic form, celebrates marital sexuality. And both Guttmacher and Feldman point out that the Talmud specifies how many times a man is obligated to have sex with his wife in a given time period. And it depends on your profession, right? So if you are a merchant and you don't travel, you just run your shop, or you're a farmer and you're around, you're expected to have more sex than if you are a camel driver and you go away for long periods of time, right? So that's what the Talmud is up to. It's like tracking professions and talking about how often you are supposed to have sex. Also, Jewish law really privileges health. So if pregnancy is going to cause a health concern, you need to protect health. The rabbis basically, or both in particular, Feldman basically implies that the correct response to this problem in like a traditional Protestant thought, and again, I'm pointing out that his Protestant colleagues, like the people he's going to clergy lunch with once a month, probably wouldn't agree with him. But Feldman is arguing that the proper kind of Christian solution to that problem would be to stop having sex. But that can't be the Jewish response, because that would leave you in violation of Jewish law, ergo contraception. And points out that the Talmud makes reference to a couple of different kinds of contraception. One that appears to be sort of an oral, sort of a tea, and one that appears to be basically a barrier device. Probably, it's called a mock, and we don't really know precisely what it is, but it sounds like it's something that is inserted, probably some sort of cervical cap, but we don't actually know. So the issue in Jewish law is not can you use contraception, they both argue. The issue in Jewish law is what kind of contraception can you use. So there are kinds of contraception that are not acceptable. It is a problem in Jewish law, and this is a little explicit, I'm sorry, but you came to a talk on reproductive health. It's unacceptable in Jewish law for a man to ejaculate into a place that is not a vagina. So condoms are a problem. This will kind of get sorted out with the AIDS epidemic, but condoms are a problem in Jewish law. A diaphragm is not, because it's okay to block sperm's passage. It's like it's gone into the right place and then a barrier isn't. But the pill is great from this standpoint, right? The pill poses no problems because it's explicitly okay to have sex with somebody in a time when they can't get pregnant, because they are pregnant, because they are postmenopausal. That's fine. So the pill works really well. So he spends a lot of time working through this. Guttmacher, drawing on his own medical practice, talks about times when he has treated the wives of Orthodox rabbis and why they can get rabbinic permission to use contraception. It becomes really clear for protection of health, of either the mother or spacing babies appropriately. So again, the question is, what can you use and when, but not if. There are a couple of things going on in this argument that have to do with how Judaism is positioning, how these Jewish leaders are positioning themselves in response to their Christian colleagues. This is the 1960s now. Judaism is one of the three American religions. This is an era that is talking about a Judeo-Christian America. And while that is a term that we don't use anymore for lots of really good reasons, it's a term that was really exciting to these leaders because a Judeo-Christian America is more inclusive of Jews than a Christian America. But they're worried that they're getting conflated with their Protestant counterparts. And so you see a really strong impetus to stake some claims. Judaism is more pro-sex than Christianity. Judaism is more pro-contraception than Christianity. Judaism has these sort of ancient traditions that allow birth control. The other thing that they're trying to do is stake their claim as modern and American, right? This is Judaism as a modern American religion, even in its ancient forms, and this is Orthodox Judaism. This isn't just the Reform forms that like kind of look pretty, that blend in to the sort of on the public stage. Even Orthodox Judaism, this conservative rabbi is arguing, is a modern American religion, and maybe even more modern than what you think of as the modern American religions, right? The Episcopalians, the United Church of Christ, the Unitarians, those folks, right? And so that's a lot of what is going on in this moment. And this was the quickest and briefest of overviews of this sort of history around contraception and tri-faith conversation. Rachel answered the question that we were posed, why do I study this? And I think that one of the most important reasons to study this is because when I think about contemporary conversations in Jewish activist arenas around birth control and abortion, this argument that I just outlined for you, that these things are protected by Jewish law, come up as really central. But I want to highlight something, and this is true of Jewish arguments. It is also deeply true of the Protestant arguments, which are a theology of responsible parenthood. These are not feminist arguments. These are not arguments about women's rights to control their bodies and their bodily autonomy. These are about sex in the context of heterosexual marriages, patriarchal heterosexual marriages. These are about creating healthy families. These are about creating healthy children. There is concern for women's health in that having a healthy wife and mother shores up those institutions. But these are not about women's self-determination. This is not about women's agency. And this will become painfully clear in the 1970s when internal Jewish conversations show really stark and striking backlash. And I'm writing about this right now. In writing about it, I'm using a phenomenal piece that Ronit wrote with two of our colleagues, thinking about the role of Jewish continuity. We can see in Jewish history that the feminist implications of Jewish support for birth control became very troubling for Jewish leaders. And we can see now in the things that are brought forward, abortion is acceptable to protect health. And yes, you can take steps and extend that to mental health. But abortion isn't about women's interiority. Contraception is not about women's interiority and their hopes and dreams for their lives. And so as we use these tools and as we think about the systems that we have created and what logics are underpinning them, I think that that may affect what rights we can use them to advocate for. And it's worth thinking about whether these are the tools to get us where we want to go or whether other models might work better. And I'm going to turn it over to Ronit.
Thank you so much. Thank you to my colleagues who've offered a lot to work with today. Before I get to my piece, I also want to thank everyone at Michigan State for helping bring together this panel, for making it happen in a hybrid form, and for all of you for being here today. And I want to thank my colleagues, and I'm actually really excited to go last because I'm building on their work. And I think one of the exciting things about current scholarship in examining the history of reproductive health, reproductive rights, reproductive freedoms, reproductive justice is the way in which there is a community of scholarship, and it highlights really the different ways we can approach these topics. So we heard from Professor Kranson, I think, a really important history of of law and activism around abortion. We heard from Professor Mehta a really important intellectual trajectory of thought, of religious thinking around contraception. And I'm going to bring those together in a discussion of both individuals and institutions and add what I think is another location that is central to this conversation, which is the role of medical professionals and in particular of hospitals in what access people have to reproductive health services. And I want to note, for example, and this is not a criticism, this is merely a recognition of the broad expanse of the ways in which reproductive health access issues are both worked on in kind of society and politics, but also the ways in which people experience them. Earlier, the list of lawyers, activists, communal leaders, and clergy were mentioned. There was a lot of, again, really rich discussion of the evolution of both Protestant and Jewish thought on birth control. But what we didn't hear so much from, maybe the exception of Guttmacher, is doctors and the leaders of healthcare institutions. And so that's what I want to focus on today, and particularly the institutional context. Because as we're seeing right now in 2022, there's not just the legal infrastructure is incredibly important. The political advocacy, both for and against reproductive rights, has been extraordinary. But at the end of the day, there's still a question of, is there a clinician who is willing and able to provide healthcare? And is there an institutional context that will permit them to do so? And so to think about this for a bit, I'm going to think particularly about the role of Jewish clinicians, particularly Jewish doctors, in the reproductive health world, but also the role of hospitals, Jewish and non-Jewish hospitals, in framing how we have arrived at the present. And so I'm going to also do a little bit of a sweeping history, but take us kind of to the middle of the first section of what was just talked about, to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, at a convention of the Catholic Hospital Association, one of the plenary addresses focused on the question of birth control and made a very strong distinction between Catholic doctrine, which is very much views any sort of anything other than what was called at the time continence, or what today is often referred to as natural family planning, but basically abstinence when one is ovulating. Anything else is morally illicit. And in this speech, the distinction was drawn, therefore, between the Christians who understood that contraception was morally illicit and everyone else, the pagans. And it was very stark. The pagans and the paganistic impulses that understood, that were interested in supporting birth control, which at the time was actually illegal in many parts of the country. And it was a time of increased activism around making contraception both permissible, legal, and accessible. And this is a moment where the Catholic Church is doubling down on its anti-contraception position. And in the 1940s, this will be written into the document that underlies Catholic hospitals, the ethical and religious directives for Catholic hospitals. And in this time period from the mid-30s, really through the early 50s, there's quite a few incidents where physicians, Protestant and Jewish, are dismissed, they're fired from Catholic hospitals, not because they prescribed contraception in Catholic hospitals, but because they advocated for the liberalization of contraception laws outside of their daily work. So when doctors acted as activists, not during their work time, but separately, there are a number of cases that get reported of doctors being terminated or their staff privileges at hospitals being rescinded. And in 1952, Monsignor Michael O'Shea says to the newspapers that any qualified doctor may apply to practice in a Catholic hospital, but he must practice in accordance with his conscience. Now, if you just read that statement, all sounds good. And yes, the medical profession was predominantly male at the time, but in accordance with his conscience, one can have a conscience that impels one toward thinking birth control has a moral underpinning. But he continues, the conscience of the individual is formed by the eternal word of God. And even here, okay, well, there's a lot of different religious groups and a lot of different interpretations of the word of God. But then he concludes, this is a point on which Catholics, Protestants, and Jews should all agree, since it's the Bible which expressly forbids birth control. End of story. And this is in many ways the justification for, again, terminating staff privileges, which means you can't practice in the hospital, which means you can't see your patients. And this justifies, for many, a shifting sense of who's on staff at hospitals. Now, at the same time this is happening, there are sets of discussions about the role of Jewish hospitals. And what are Jewish hospitals supposed to do? Who are they serving? There are questions in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, as Jewish communities are changing, as to, again, what's the function of the Jewish hospital? There were, in major metropolitan areas with large Jewish populations, many Jewish hospitals that had been founded starting in the 1850s, but an acceleration in the early 20th century as well of Jewish hospitals. The founding of most of these hospitals was premised on several elements of connection to the Jewish community. One is that in almost all of the I shouldn't say almost all, I haven't seen enough to make that claim, but in most of the documents I've seen of early articles of incorporation and bylaws of Jewish hospitals, one thing they promise is kosher food, that this is very, very important. They're also founded in an era where there is discrimination and anti-Semitism that precludes Jewish doctors both from entrance into medical school and to getting staff positions at hospitals. This is a tricky domain because there are an abundance of Jewish applicants to medical schools, and the medical profession by the 20th century does become, if you're comparing it statistically to the demographics of the United States, Jews are overrepresented in medicine. But there are more Jews who still want to become doctors, and they need places both to be trained and to practice. And so Jewish hospitals see themselves as serving this function as well. And there are arguments, especially in the 1930s, about expanding Jewish hospitals to, again, serve the pool of American Jews who want to become doctors and want to practice. But there's a question also of who do these hospitals serve? They, like other religious hospitals, are certainly open to everyone, which is to say their patient populations are demographically diverse, at least religiously. Racially, it will depend on where in the country they are. But this is a major question and often centered on in what ways do Jewish hospitals serve the Jewish community? And in what ways can we see them as, this is the language of Israel Strauss in the 1930s, as these are institutions that exist to the credit of our people. And there are arguments also against the fear of offending our Christian neighbors with the cultivation of Jewish hospitals and Jewish institutions. And so on the one hand, there's this push and a drive for increased Jewish hospitals institutionally. At the same time, there's a very clear line of many people both within and connected to Jewish hospitals who have an extraordinary amount of faith in the state and the faith in the government, that actually Jewish hospitals may not be so necessary in the future because the government should step in, because government-provided healthcare is the way of the future. They weren't right, but they were deep believers, and they cared a lot. And they really thought that where Jews should therefore place their advocacy and emphasis was on the state, was on the government. Notably absent in many of these conversations is a discussion of religion and medical ethics that is a corollary to that which existed in Catholic hospitals, which is to say, the idea of halakha or any sort of Jewish theology determining the nature of care. So in many ways, the conversations you just heard about earlier today, it's not that people didn't know they were going on, but they were in many ways siloed from the conversations about hospitals as institutions, as representations of the community. And this divergence and the lack of integration of these two conversations will have implications not only for the institution themselves, but politically over time. Because part of what happens over time is that Jewish hospitals see themselves as shifting. The rampant discrimination of the early 20th century diminishes to the point where people can get jobs at an array of institutions. They don't need Jewish doctors don't need Jewish hospitals as a place to practice. So what are the purpose of Jewish hospitals? In 1972, Mitchell Rabkin, who is the head of Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, is at a convention. Conventions are very important to figuring out what was going on in these institutions. He's at a convention of Jewish hospital administrators, and he argues that the conclusion to be drawn for the Jewish hospital is critical. to continue to pursue the original goals of our institutions, we must establish a solid position in the more general society to guarantee a strong viability under the compelling rules set by that society. So we've got to serve broader society. No longer can we do what's good for the Jews and be content with the spill-off, which may or may not help the rest of the community. Instead, he argues, for our original purpose to survive today, we must ask first what is good for the community, but define community broadly: egalitarian, geographic, and secular. And this is going to be a major shift in how Jewish hospitals both see themselves, present themselves, and articulate their positions within broader society. And it's happening at the same moment where there's a divergence among religious hospitals. Jewish hospitals are not the only hospitals turning to a more kind of secular positioning, but Catholic hospitals in particular are turning to what some call sort of a doubling down of their religious identity. There's also conflict in Catholic hospitals between the bishops and the theologians arguing in the early 1970s for sort of a pluralist vision that is much more akin to Jewish hospitals, saying if you serve everyone, you have to be able to work with the religious views and values of everyone. But in terms of, to go back to what we said earlier, kind of thinking about how do we understand and analyze and understand the impact of these decisions, I think here too we see a sense of misplaced confidence, which was the notion that by positioning Jewish hospitals and Jewish ideas about medicine as in fact secular, it loses some space for Jews within arguments about religion, and especially around reproductive rights. And so as questions ethically emerge in the public sphere, in the legal sphere in the 1970s and beyond, about not just reproductive health, about end-of-life care, questions that will arise around the HIV epidemic, questions that will arise ultimately over LGBT care as well, but really originating in many ways with questions particularly over reproductive health and brain death, which are the two zones in which actually Jews and Catholics differ tremendously. Jewish hospitals as institutions do not cultivate their power institutionally to object and to try to shift the framework of conversations, while Catholic hospitals and Catholic healthcare writ large builds a tremendous infrastructure to defend their claims about what is moral and immoral in healthcare. So there's a tremendous imbalance that's built institutionally, not intentionally, but as a byproduct of decisions of how the Jewish community understands its institutions as communal institutions, what community it serves, and therefore what it needs to do. And this will have tremendous implications that I think we can get into later in a discussion for today about how different groups are positioned individually, theologically, but also institutionally.
All right. Well, thank you so much for really fantastic papers that really weave together really, really well in my view. I'm so excited to be able to talk about them. What I'm going to do, I really want to hear from the audience as well. We came up with some questions. I think maybe I just want to start off with just one question to get you guys talking, and then we'll invite questions from the audience and we'll kind of chip in as needed. But I'm really struck, one of the things we really want to know about, and you guys have really complicated it as we thought about it beforehand, is, typically abortion, and reproductive freedom in political spheres, the opposition to it is religious, right? This is a religious perspective on abortion, is a negative, right? Is a ban that bans are shaped by religion. And I'm curious, especially with the discussion about Jews and secularity, right, and secularism and the complicated decisions that they make, how does thinking about Jews shape our perspective on this, or how should it shape our perspective on this? That's kind of the central question. Why are we having this panel, right? And I wonder if you guys could speak to that, like what Jews in particular offers us to question and rethink about, reproductive freedom as religious, or questions about reproductive freedom as religious.
So I guess a place where I would start with that, right, is to say, I have my critiques of the ways in which Jewish law, like we're as activists, people are very much mobilizing Jewish law to feminist ends, but Jewish law is not inherently like a feminist set of practices. And so while I have my critiques of that, I still think you can look at it. And I don't want to step on Rachel's toes here, but for instance, by talking about abortion instead of birth control, Rachel, that's how I would be stepping on your toes. I would, pardon me?
My toes are just fine.
As is probably obvious to all of you, the three of us talk to each other a lot. And there are some others who are not here, right? But Jewish law says basically that a fetus's potential life and a pregnant person, it's Jewish law, so a woman, a mother, is a life. And that potential life is extremely important and is to be protected at almost all costs, but not at the cost of life. And so, Jewish law basically says at any stage of a pregnancy, you can abort to save the life of the woman. And according to a colleague of ours who is a Jewish ethicist who was sort of clearing up some of my halakhic misconceptions, it's the head out of the birth canal is the moment at which what you have are two lives. That's it. And so up until that moment, like up until you're in the middle of labor and delivery, it can be a religious obligation to perform an abortion. So in that way, you can make the argument that term limit, like on abortion, so like a ban after 20 weeks or 22 weeks or whatever, 6 weeks, is a restriction of Jewish religious freedom. And you can carry that out in a number of ways. Now, as Rachel has talked about, the real question is what happens when a group that is not only a demographic minority group, which conservative Christians also are, but a minority group from the standpoint of power and clout, tries to make a case like that? That's a different question, and I'll turn it over to her because she has spent a lot more time on law. But, that's one answer. Do you actually want me to turn it over to you?
Yeah, I can certainly respond. Yeah, the question of how Jewish ideas or Jewish law should be harnessed I have to just say, is something I really want to give to my colleagues who are lawyers. I am not one, but I can offer some things that I noted about legal arguments in the past that I haven't seen used yet, and I'd like to see where they could go, at least intellectually. I would leave it to my colleagues who are litigators to actually decide if these are worthwhile strategies. But when the American Jewish Congress and other liberal or Jewish organizations worked with other liberal religious organizations in America to write that 1989 amicus brief, Martha Minow was the lead author on that, to the Webster case. They made a case about whether abortion access should be protected through the free exercise clauses of the First Amendment. And the way that they conceptualized that was that they used the free exercise clause. They defined it really expansively, basically to say that any pregnant woman, and again they were working within the gender binary, that any pregnant woman should be able to look to her own conscience and own morality, be that religious or not, including religion, right? Not exclusively religious, in order to make a free exercise claim. Now, this is really compelling to me. This is really interesting to be able to expand the First Amendment in a way in which it kind of acts a lot like the implied right to privacy of the 14th Amendment. Now, there is a reason that most litigators at the time, including Jewish American lawyer Harriet Philpell, chose to use the 14th Amendment rather than the First Amendment, because she thought, and for many years she was right, that the courts were more likely to take a 14th Amendment guarantee and to expand that and to use that more expansively than they were inclined to use the First Amendment. They saw the First Amendment as being more limited, at least in the way that it was likely to be harnessed. But we should be aware that not only is it possible to consider the Free Exercise Clause more expansively, but the argument has been made that it should be used in this expansive way. And at least intellectually, ethically, morally, I don't want to give up on the idea that the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment should be used for much more than just guaranteeing conservative Christians every religious freedom claim that they bring to bear, or that they bring to the Supreme Court. It can be used in really different ways, and I would argue should be used in really different ways.
To that, I would say, I think it becomes really important to both recognize that lawyers are, of course, and litigators in particular, are adopting legal strategies to meet the courts that they are addressing. So there's sort of legal strategies for particular moments and context, and there are also then principles to which people can hold. And so I do think those have to in some ways be separated out, that I'm, again, neither a litigator nor a political strategist, so I can't say, exactly what has the best shot of working with the current court, but I understand that is a lens through which decisions are made. But I also think there is, of course, the court of public opinion, and there is changing broader public arguments, and as political scientists would say, the Overton window of what's acceptable. And I think there is the kind of the broader arguments within society and politics, what becomes really important, and the way I think the Jewish perspectives, and of course they're not singular, they've evolved over time, but what they do is, and now I sound very much just like a scholar, is they add complexity. But I think that complexity is actually really important, because I think what politics does at a very base level is simplify and say, this is religion, religion is anti-abortion, or, you can imagine already down the line, religion is anti-contraception. But that is a fundamentally false statement, because there is no single religion that has a singular stance. And so what I think the value in particular of Jewish thought and Jewish voices on issues related to reproductive politics, but more broadly as well, is to say, wait a second here, what you're saying stands in as religion is not in fact the whole story. And so our obligation in that sense is to say there is a broad spectrum. And so if you care about people having rights, which not everyone does, quite frankly. But if that is something that you care about, then you have to recognize that there is a broad spectrum of religious views on this particular topic, and to respect that, to respect, therefore, both free exercise and not establishing a religious perspective, which, again, the court basically okays in Harris versus McRae. It's been done. But to push back against that, I think part of what has to happen is public voices saying, wait a second, there's more to the situation.
And I just want to add, so I wrote something over the summer, or in May, that was basically 5 kind of major world religions' takes on abortion, just like a little paragraph for each one. And in each, I sort of tried to outline the range of views, right? So it's not just that it's complicated in Judaism, or as perhaps we are all aware, or hopefully I made clear, complicated in Christianity, right? Like not only Protestantism and Catholicism, but there are Protestant and Catholic, like a range of views internal to each. And especially if you're talking about sort of believers, right? This is also true of Hinduism, it's true of Buddhism, it's true of Islam. And when I wrote this piece, the Hindus and Buddhists, like nobody did this, but Christians, Muslims, and Jews all wrote in to tell me that I was absolutely wrong, that there were any circumstances that permitted abortion. The person who wrote in on the part of Judaism said, like, except obviously to save the life of the mother, but nothing, no concern around health or anything like that, which is not the position of the Reform, the Conservative, the Reconstructionist, the Renewal, the modern Orthodox movements, right? And there's similar, again, diversity in the others. So there is this, I think, impulse on the part of sort of more fundamentalist believers and also more fundamentalist politicians and lawmakers to sort of say, no, there is a correct interpretation, and it is no, right? But as a scholar trained in religious studies, what I have to say is, like, no, the question isn't which religions are right or wrong, right? The question is, what is the religious diversity present, and how do you talk about that massive complexity in a world of sound bites so as to secure the broadest rights for the broadest number of people?
I'd also like to add something else from an activist perspective in terms of what Jewish perspectives on, or I should say liberal Jewish perspectives on abortion can do. And I'd also like to point out about the way that they both have impacted and can impact coalitional politics and activism. If there's a broad understanding that Jews, that liberal Christians, that many religionists have a really important stake in abortion rights, also because of religious freedom issues, that expands the number of people who can really get behind intensive high stakes activism over to try to ensure reproductive rights. And certainly we can quibble over ethically whether, Jewish law is the most feminist argument, the best argument to make. But there are people who really see that, insofar as there are people who really see that as an important issue for them, it can expand the broad coalition of people who see themselves as having a stake in these laws and in these politics.
I certainly agree, right? Like, I don't want to imply that because I am quibbling with the degree to which it's feminist, I think it's not an important sort of coalition building tool. I think about these things when I'm wearing my scholar hat, right? Like, I sort of feel like I need to point these things out. And then when I'm wearing my activist hat, I'm interested in coalition building, but I'm also interested in thinking about how to expand and push beyond where we are, right? And I'm not saying this because I think that Rachel wouldn't agree with me, right? I'm just sort of saying, like, I think that the piece about building coalition is really, really central. But when I'm thinking as a Jew rather than as a Jewish studies scholar, I'm not scholarship, I'm a scholar. When I'm thinking as a Jew and as a Jewish feminist, I'm asking, how do I push the feminism that informs and animates my religious life?
All right. Well, why don't we open it up a little bit? Yes. Can I ask you to walk over to the microphone? Otherwise, no one will be able to hear you.
Okay, my name is Anna Kirkwood Graham, and I also teach here at MSU. I teach Latin. I teach broad cultural courses. One of them is on Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the Middle Ages. And I've written a lot on this ever since I was in law school, from a bioethical standpoint, but also from a history of religion standpoint. And I pride myself on my understanding of the Catholic history on abortion and why it's so wrong on abortion today, because that history really, before the 19th century, contradicts what it teaches today completely. Okay, so my standpoint is there aren't really religious grounds for denying abortion in the first place if you have any understanding of soul and the history of thinking about soul. And a lot of that has to do with this misinterpretation of philosophical language. But having said that, and I apologize for not wearing a mask. I just didn't remember. I've gotten out of the habit, but
That's okay. Don't
I'm
worry about
not trying to be disrespectful. You know, I do have a question about, you were talking about Judaism requiring abortion when the mother's life is threatened, which is as it should be. That's what should happen. What happens with lethal deformities of the fetus? Is that covered in Jewish law? And does it permit abortion? Then my second question is, and this is a very small, specific one, about contraceptives and the permissibility of the ones that don't involve depositing sperm in the wrong spot. Now, is that because of onanism? Is that, yeah, okay. So that's already taken care of. Yeah. Yeah, well, that was one that Catholicism abused for a long time as a justification for denying contraception. And there was one other thing that I believe you said, I think, no, maybe it was you, but when you talk about Christian attitudes, or no, it was about hospitals and, you know, denying abortion and contraceptive, where have you seen them say the Bible prohibits contraception? I mean, what verse? What point in the Bible? Is it onanism? Is it, you know, where is that point in the Bible that doesn't permit contraception? And I'll go sit down now.
To be perfectly honest, I don't have a verse to cite to you right now, in part because a lot of this comes through reports about conventions from which we don't have archivally necessarily the full speech. We tend to get some selected quotes. So I can't tell you exactly what they said. I can certainly look through my notes, and I'm sure there are places I do know where it's documented. I don't have it just off the top of my head. But I do think, there's, Bible verses functionally can be used, in a lot of different ways. And sometimes, I will say that sometimes they're used as sort of cues, like you should get this reference, and here it is. And other times it is much more of an interpretation or an extrapolation. But I can look through notes later and send you an email.
And in terms of the question of fetal deformity, I think it's an important thing to remember, right, that the law is that when people sort of say like the law, they mean something that's quite a bit older than, for instance, ultrasound technology, but certainly than prenatal testing, right, than amniocentesis or whatever. And so what you then have, you have a wide range of ways in which people interpret that law. So generally speaking, what doesn't carry weight is sort of a rabbinic comment with like a sort of if you're trying to get permission, right? And it's really important to note that the vast majority of American Jews would never go to their rabbi or their cantor for permission to have an abortion, right? They might for support, they might for counseling, but they probably wouldn't for permission. It is, however, you can see places where it's of immense comfort to people who do want permission that they can get it, right? Like that's an important thing to note. But what you're gonna get is individual interpretation. Generally speaking, it doesn't really fly to say this life won't be worth living. What you can say is this is a fetal deformity that will result in certain death. This is not really, and the impact on the existing lives will be really horrible and really traumatic. The amount of grief and depression, the attention that it will take away from existing siblings. And that's the kind of thing that gets marshaled. Like the classic example would be Tay-Sachs. There are absolutely also people who worry that that's a slippery slope, right? Like where do you say, okay, this is being used against disability for which you can test, right? So that kind of ethical debate will happen. And so it's often a more persuasive or a more sort of, persuasive is the wrong word. It's more likely when there's a clear sense that either in the extremely short term or in a slightly longer term, it's not going to be viable for this fetus will not turn into a child that will grow and thrive.
Thanks for these amazing papers and discussion. I'm Carla Goldman from the University of Michigan. A couple questions. Ronit, hi Rachel. What was it? Okay, I'll start with the other one. What Samira was saying about range of views related to abortion within Judaism, I'm also thinking about how that comes up against whenever Jews bring to courts, this is Jewish, no, this is Jewish. And the courts tend to say, well, don't ask us what's Jewish, it's up to you, right? So there's this kind of thing in what you were discussing, the simple, making it more simple, that they'll be well, who looks like more authentic Jews, right? In the Supreme Court. So it's I think there's a problem with trying to make the complex case, right? Because generally American courts can't manage that, is what we've seen in lots of other kinds of questions that are brought to them. So just a sort of observation on that. And then, Ronit, I was thinking about, you seem to be suggesting there was a shift when Rabkin says, well, really we should go to what, the secular standard is, or what's the good of the community. But I just wanted, if you could be a little more specific about, what comes before that, because I think I also heard you say, and I think I've seen that these hospitals in general didn't operate on saying, what's the Jewish approach to this? What are the Jewish values, right? They were really looking more at what does the community need? Who is our community, right? They weren't saying what does Jewish law say or Jewish practice say about these. But I imagine, and I'm pretty sure in your work, that when these mergers happen between Jewish and Catholic hospitals, that these questions come into very sharp focus. And I'm wondering, my impression has been that those get played out on the field of, but our community needs this, do the sort of the arguments about what are Jewish values in relationship to reproductive rights come into play as versus we have served the needs of our community and these are services that have been, I know a lot of some of those mergers just end up excluding those services, but I'm sure that's a whole dissertation in itself. Thank you.
I can respond to the first part of the question, and Carla, I can't see you, but it is nice to hear your voice. In terms of, in the courts, some religious leaders saying, this is what Jewish law says, and it mandates abortion, and then other Jewish leaders saying, well, actually, it doesn't, except in very, very rare cases when a mother's life is in danger. This certainly has happened in Congress, in the courts, and one way that the liberal lawyers of the American Jewish Congress and others have tried to get beyond that again was with their expansive view of the free exercise clause, because if you're using the free exercise clause to create an exemption, the question then becomes, can this individual make a case that their particular religious conscience or moral conscience necessitates justifies or shows the need for an abortion in this case. In which case it wouldn't matter if they're competing views in Jewish law. What would matter is that this person's moral conscience, which might be based on their particular religious leader or rabbi, if they can make the case that that kind of line of thought says that they ought to be able to terminate this pregnancy, that's all that matters. And so it kind of gets beyond some of that, I don't know, those discussions about Jewish law that ended up in the courts or ended up before Congress that really, as you mentioned, should never have been there in the first place. So I'll leave it at that. The question about hospitals, I will have to turn over to.
Okay. A couple of things. And I think on the question of deference, just briefly, it is true that courts do not want to get involved in religious disputes, and there's a long line of cases in which the goal is has become to sort of accept the position that a plaintiff offers. What's tricky though is, and I do think this is something that we'll see what happens as cases come before the courts, is when there is that in some ways it's very easy with some religions to make a claim that the religion says X because there's written documentation and a hierarchical authority. And so even if the laity disagree, there is kind of doctrine. What is, I think, challenging though, is that when there are clear differences and people, and again, courts are trying to avoid making these distinctions, but they do rule in ways that ultimately sort of sanction one version or the other. So, I think we'll see how that plays out, but I do think it's quite tricky. And sometimes the rulings are for technical reasons, but they nevertheless sort of sanction a particular perspective. When it comes to Jewish hospitals, I think one of the things I've been really struggling to work out in my research is figuring out, I'm very committed, as a book project, that this involves religious hospitals of a variety of kinds and denominations, in part because they all in some way identify as religious hospitals at one point in time or another. And it matters for constitutional reasons, and it matters for how they position themselves in broader society. What's tricky, and this is sort of a parallel to what I just said, is that they don't all operate through the same understanding of what a religious institution is or does. And therefore, a Jewish hospital and a Catholic hospital can both claim to be religious hospitals. But if you look at the kind of like how they, I would say two things. One, if you look at actually operationally how they work, one space, religious doctrine, plays a very significant role in governing what is allowed and what isn't. And in one space, it really, frankly, doesn't. There are some cases around, I think the best, and I'm still doing the archival work to uncover this story, but with Jewish hospitals, again, brain death in the late 1960s, the Harvard Committee on Brain Death asserts that brain death is death. And this is actually a major issue for Jews halakhically. And because there are a large number of Jewish hospitals in New York and New Jersey, it's a question that really does play out in these institutions as to whether they will certify brain death as death. But outside of that, there aren't a lot of ways in which Jewish hospitals are when I've asked people who are like, there's a religion committee of this Jewish hospital, what were the issues it discussed? Kashrut, Shabbat elevators, the holiday, will the OR be open on Rosh Hashanah kind of thing, which is different than the questions that are happening in Catholic hospitals. So in that sense, religion works very differently. What I have noticed in looking at papers, both papers of Jewish hospitals and the debates that emerge in journals around Jewish hospitals, is that they actually, the questions that people are asking are about what they are as communal institutions, not so much as religious institutions. There are good legal and political reasons to externally frame the institution as a religious entity, But internally, the discussions are much more about community. And so I think part of what gets really tricky, and there are real questions when Jewish and Catholic hospitals merge, which are different than when Jewish hospitals merge with other entities. Like when in Boston, when Beth Israel merges with Deaconess, which had been a Methodist hospital, they commit to being a new secular institution. That is an impossibility in a merger with a Catholic institution. And to the best of my knowledge, no Jewish institution that has merged or come into an affiliation with a Catholic hospital has managed to write a contract that avoids the ethical and religious directives applying to them. So, the Jewish Hospital of Louisville, Kentucky was acquired by a Catholic healthcare system. It's now part of the University of Louisville. These things go through multiple iterations, but, the ERD is applied in a place called the Jewish Hospital. There are other examples of this as well. So it also means that it's very hard for someone to tell, like, what is this institution? I mean, how do you characterize a place whose name is Jewish Hospital, but the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare govern what is allowed? The one final thing I'll say is that in observing how these issues play out, not just with Jewish hospitals, but also with other religious hospitals, with public institutions, and with other private institutions, most recently controversies at Oberlin College about their healthcare system, is that a lot of people don't know how the ERDs work or what they say. And it's not something that institutions that are writing contracts necessarily flag. So unless you have an attorney whose due diligence includes really reading through this document to understand what it means, it can be very easy, and a number of major public institutions have done this as well, is not realize until too late what they've signed on to. So that's another challenge in this domain.
Thank you for a really interesting, informative, and timely panel. So I thought it was really interesting looking at the more narrow and expansive ways of interpreting the health of the mother and how that can, eventually, if it would be used as religious freedom, be used in a much more expansive way. What I'd love to hear more about is if there are kind of arguments based on Judaism that go beyond health of the mother, even expansively interpreted. Are there other kind of religious conscious arguments other than that? And I'd love to hear about whether those are increasingly becoming part of the debates.
So there is one document from the Reform movement that talks about bodily autonomy. It's thinner on the ground than it might otherwise be, but they've got sort of a statement that isn't, it's not sort of grounded in halakhic arguments in the same way. It's more of a sort of institutional position. What health is gets expanded and played out in interesting ways, right? So you have statements saying, for instance, mental health and physical health are to be held as equal. So depending on how loosely somebody is interested in interpreting things. And again, it's really important to remember that this for the vast majority of American Jews, right? This isn't actually going to matter very much because this isn't how their relationship to law works. But will it be devastating? You're in college, you're pregnant, you would have to drop out. Would that be devastating to your emotional, mental health? One could make that argument. People make economic arguments that, again, stem back to health. There are absolutely Jewish ethicists talking about abortion who will say you may not have an abortion for economic reasons, or for educational reasons. Those are not good reasons. Those arguments absolutely exist. There are people who will say, if having a third kid means you can't feed the 2 kids that you already have adequately, that's a reason, right? And so I think that the answer is health can be treated as this amazingly elastic term, which is different from saying, right, that it by definition must be. Rachel?
actually wondering in your question if you were thinking about how this plays out in Jewish law or in the courts or politically, because it's different in all three
Right.
places. Although I will also
Sorry, I was thinking of
say-
the courts and politically. So I was thinking the mental health, you can be very expansive, but there are there arguments beyond even the mental health kind of argument that are really gaining currency or not?
Right, well, so what has gained currency for a long time actually is this idea that Jewish women, and again, that was the language they were using, should be able to turn to their own religious conscience. And there wasn't always an explanation other as to what that would be, other than to say it's up to religious authorities or religious traditions to decide, not up to the state itself. And I think that's important too, because it opens up room for a lot of ways to ask that question, or to even to answer the question of what does Judaism say about the permissibility of abortion, because again, Jewish authorities can answer that question based on very strict interpretations of Jewish law. They can answer it based on the history of Jewish thought. They can answer it based on post-Holocaust Jewish thought, which is which is something that I've written a chapter on, and something I'm not going to get into right now, except there's a lot there. So there's a lot that can go. Suffice it to say, there's a lot that can go into answering that question, including this idea of Jewish values, that saving a life is the most important thing. The mother's life is the only real life, and therefore anything goes, right? So there's a lot of ways in which Jewish authorities can answer that question, and the exact way that they answer that question, at least in terms of the law, has been a little bit less important than the individual conscience, which again is a very Protestant idea, but it's one in some ways that might serve well in terms of this particular issue.
Well, and I was just sort of to highlight something in what Rachel said, right? And kind of to pick up on when I kept saying, like, this doesn't actually matter for many, many people, right? The instant you say individual conscience, sort of as a Jew, like if you're not a halakhically observant Jew, then every single one of those things that Rachel just opened up, but also the opportunity to make your own decision based on whatever you want to make your decision on, theoretically is opened up in that space.
I'll also just add that there are a number of Jewish abortion providers who have, really made a deliberate effort to go on their record saying they are abortion providers because of their, Jewish identities and Jewish values, and that it comes out of a place of religious values that's led them, on this career path. And so there's obviously the patients making their own decisions. There's the capacity of clinics to remain open, but the providers themselves, some Jewish abortion providers are, really being very intentional about going on the record as this is actually about them living their Jewish values.
There's been a lot of discussion about Jewish bases for allowing abortions, some as a right for everybody, some as a religious exemption. And there's also been, some briefer talk about the idea of bodily autonomy. A number of people talked out in the political arena have said that the religious freedom argument is ultimately more persuasive with many of Americans than the bodily autonomy one. So I'm wondering what you all think about that, and also whether they can be used together or whether they contradict each other.
Rachel, do you want to take that one to start?
I'm sorry, I'm suffering from COVID brain.
No worries. I just wanted, it had enough of a legal history angle to it that I thought I would. So I think, you can hear in the legal history that Rachel outlined, some of the reasons why the religious freedom argument has been really persuasive. And I think you can hear in some of the theology that I've worked through, this idea that bodily autonomy is not the thing that Jewish thought leads with. It's not the thing that Protestant thought leads with. It's not the thing when the Papal Commission on Birth Control recommends to the Vatican that they go with yes on contraception, at least specifically on the birth control pill. It's not the reason that they lead with either, right? And so I think that bodily autonomy is a really important piece of the sort of secular feminist argument for reproductive justice. It's really central to how many non-religious activist groups organize themselves, but it doesn't have the same kind of religious thought history backing it up, at least not necessarily super specifically. You get moral, sort of the right to moral conscience in Protestant conversation, but it's not this right of bodily autonomy. That doesn't mean it's not important. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be mobilized. But it does mean that sort of the like, I keep thinking this, I'm sorry, this is like a metaphor, but if you think about how water will run down paths where water has already run before, I think that's a little bit of what you end up seeing in these moments.
Okay, it takes me a second to organize my thoughts. I do have something to add to that really, I think, astute answer, which is that in some ways, the 14th Amendment's right to privacy seems to me to be very akin in certain ways to a bodily autonomy argument, in the sense that people should have the right to make private decisions over their reproductive destinies. This was just overturned, right? The current court says that pregnant people do not have that right. So if we're working in a system that basically denies the closest thing we have to a constitutional right to bodily autonomy, then the question then becomes, in some ways, well, then what can we use? And I think, considering the current court, the First Amendment has potential. Can it be will it be as overarching as we might want it to be? Will it always, will the logic always be even ethically acceptable? Maybe not, but it does seem like something we should be able to harness and explore, given that that's, at least the free exercise amendment is one that's being circulated a lot in ways that are successful. And even if it isn't successful, the question then is, well, then what is it going to teach the American people? So,
Rachel,
sorry, kind of a complex.
can I ask you something about that?
Yeah.
So I find the argument that you just made really persuasive, but I also sometimes, like, I think of the right to privacy and the right to bodily autonomy as it's played out in reproductive health, right? It's the privacy in Griswold versus Connecticut, which is my very favorite Supreme Court case, partly because I'm from New Haven, and so the Planned Parenthood in question is also the first place I ever got access to contraception. Is like, it's about the marital bedroom, right? It's not, again, about an autonomous woman or pregnant person or person with a uterus. It's about the heterosexual marital bedroom. And yes, it will eventually be expanded to the non-marital bedroom, to the two consenting adults bedroom. But I wonder how important is that distinction is the question. Like, this isn't a got you question. This is you read legal stuff a lot more than I do, that Roe was a doctor-patient relationship. And so I'm just really curious how conflatable those two things appear to be.
Yeah, and I
Right, and I think I'm just sort of saying, like, how close?
And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that certainly the history of how we got to a law that has done some really important things on the ground in terms of bodily autonomy was not originally based on that idea, and it's not an idea that has been well supported in American law. That being said, the thing that was closest to it has now been overturned. So what do we use? That's really it was very much a kind of a very practical instrumentalist argument, and very much not very much not an ethical one. I absolutely recognize the problematic history of how we got to Roe and how we got to Griswold and the other things that the 14th Amendment brought us, at least for a while.
Okay, so, yeah, so please go ahead. Are we okay? So we've gone a little bit over, but we started late. Yeah, no, good, but yes, go ahead, please.
Hi there. My name is Julie. I'm an undergraduate student here at Michigan State. I have a question just regarding kind of the political sphere in terms of language specifically. So the common term that has been used to describe anti-abortion advocates is pro-life. They utilize that term fairly commonplace. But you guys have mentioned throughout your discussion being kind of the cornerstone of some of the Jewish arguments being the prioritization of mother's life. And so I'm wondering sort of what's the next step would be to then reject like their interpretation and redefine it like on Jewish terms, or would it be to come up with kind of a new term to utilize that movement?
So I'm blanking on the name, and I'm tempted to pop open my computer. The Nun, Sister Joan. There is a nun who makes the very persuasive argument that, and there's a quote, it circulates, that you're not pro-life, you're pro-birth, if you don't want to see like a child housed, a child fed, a child educated. So I think that part of the reason for the emphasis on life is that the pro-choice, pro-life movement has named itself the pro-life movement, and they're marshaling this idea like of love for babies and love for babies' lives and the question of fetal pain during the right, and it's a very emotive argument, and it really worked on a lot of people, right? Like I say this to my students. I teach a class called Religion and Reproductive Politics in the United States, and do I believe that anti-abortion laws and the anti-contraception laws that you can see being advanced in places are fundamentally sort of institutional structural misogyny? I do believe that. But do I believe that many, many people who support them love babies and think of babies as innocent lives and think of pregnant people as adults who should not be able to murder innocent babies to live out because of they don't want to live with the consequences of their actions? Yeah, I do believe that. And I believe that in part because I love people who believe that, right? And I think that they are not being disingenuous with me. I just think they're wrong. And so, I think that marshaling other questions and understandings of what it means to be pro-life is potentially useful. I will also say that, there have been moments when we've sort of sounded like scholars, and there have been moments when we've sounded like activists. As a scholar, I think it's really important to use the names that people use to name themselves and then to unpack them and to think about why those terms are important to them, what they're getting at, what it means, and also to get at the places where it's potentially covering up ideological inconsistency, which is sort of the scholarly way of saying hypocritical. But it turns out that I got tenure and I am a little bit less careful with my language. But as an activist circles will often not say pro-life. They'll say anti-choice. And they'll say anti-choice for precisely those reasons, right? This is not whose life. Sometimes it's dispute about whether a fetus is alive, right? Sometimes it's saying you're not pro the life of the woman, you're not pro the life of the girl who has been raped. You are not pro the life of the other kids in the family. You're not right. You're not pro-life if you want to see a child born but not a child fed. And so I think language is really powerful and really important. And I think one of the things that the pro-life movement did brilliantly well was claim the term of being the people who loved babies.
I realize I've had a turn, but I'd just like to make one quick comment. Oh, I'm sorry.
You need to do it at the microphone.
Oh,
So let me just say. So go ahead, quick comment at the microphone. This will be all final, but please stay in your seats because we have important information to give you afterwards. So go ahead.
And this is specifically to Yale's question about religious, objections, what kind of moral religious objections there are to abortion and what are the justifications. Historically, the law was influenced by a notion that life didn't begin. And this was true in the common law as well as in other, secular religious systems. Life didn't begin for the purposes of murder until you could define the life as human, okay? And that depended on the stages of ensoulment. We don't talk about that anymore. There's no understanding of soul in American constitutional law, although Roe versus Wade actually corresponded to the stages of ensoulment that I'm being very weird here. I understand it's not the language that you usually use. But my point is that if you're a Jew and your moral understanding is that life begins when the baby takes its first breath, then there should be a religious basis for abortion at any point during pregnancy, because the soul has not been absorbed into the human body until that point. And so if you base your arguments about the permissibility of abortion on whether a human life is present, it isn't present until the baby is ensouled in the law as it was historically. And Roe versus Wade reflected the Christian understanding that you're ensouled at different stages of pregnancy. At first, you only have the vegetative soul. Then you have the animal soul. This is all in Aristotle, okay? It's Aristotle we're talking about. But that's why abortion was traditionally, even in the Catholic Church, always permissible at the beginning, because you were not destroying a human life. And that was true in the common law, too, the Anglo-American common law. So that's just, to answer.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you. Let's give thank you very much. It's really interesting and important. So thank you so much for our fantastic panelists and for wonderful questions from the audience. Really, this has been just a really fantastic. I've been taking tons of notes, so thank you all to everyone. Let me just leave you with a few things. The first is that we have lunch for you, so please come eat it. Come downstairs with us. It is at the corner of, it's right outside. Come downstairs, eat lunch. It's free. We would love to have you eat with us, please. The second thing I want to announce is that this is the beginning of the conversation. On October 16th, please write this down. I apologize, we don't have any flyers, but on October 16th, we will have further conversation about this with a Michigan history focus. Gillian Frank will be speaking about Jews and Michigan history and reproductive freedom. And then Representative Alyssa Slotkin and Dana Nessel, Attorney General Dana Nessel, will both be here to talk about reproductive freedom in Michigan and their position as Jewish women and as political activists. So we really hope you will come, bring friends, bring everyone. It will be here, same place. The final thing I'd like to announce is simply that the Jewish Studies program has been working very hard on a guide to anti-Semitism. This is a slightly different subject, but we have written a guide that we are quite proud of. We would love to share it with you. So tomorrow evening, beginning at 5 o'clock, we will will have copies of that guide available. That is in the union, is at the MSU Union. There are flyers there if you need more details. We'll be speaking about that guide, and then we will have Sarah Horowitz, a fantastic historian, speaking about gender and anti-Semitism. So we would love to see all of you there. Thank you so much for spending your weekend with us. We're super grateful. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and come eat.